Thanks, everyone. We're going to move back into the program. You're ready to go? Okay, I have to introduce the next speaker, Daniela Rosner. Daniela Rosner is a professor in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering, or HCDE, at the University of Washington, co-director of the Tactile and Tactical Design Lab, and co-director of the HCDE Master's Program. She holds adjunct appointments in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, the Department of Digital Arts and Experimental Media, and the Allen School for Computer Science and Engineering. She also serves as an associate member of the Einstein Center for Digital Futures in Berlin, Germany. Her work lies at the intersection of design and social science, and especially across the fields of human-computer interaction and science and technology studies. She is the author of several articles on craft and technoculture, including The Bias Cut Toward a Technopoetics of Algorithmic Systems, published in Journal of Catalyst Feminism Theory Technoscience. Her book, Critical Fabulations, published by MIT Press. In her book, Critical Fabulations, published by MIT Press, she investigates new ways of thinking about design's past to rework future relationships between technical and social responsibility. Rosner earned her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. She also holds a BFA in graphic design from the Rhode Island School of Design and an MS in computer science from the University of Chicago. In chapter 11 of my book, I included Rosner's project, Making Core Memory, a collaboration with Samantha Shorey, Brock Kraft, and Helen Remick. This was a workshop in which participants made an electronic quilt from patches that rematerialize magnetic core memory, the mechanism through which computers stored and retrieved information. I also cite Rosner's excellent book, Critical Fabulations, particularly her challenge to the 4 pillars of canonicity, which are individualism, universalism, objectivism, and solutionism. Following Daniela's talk, the Q&A will be moderated by Heidi Cole. Please join me in welcoming Daniela Rosner.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks so much to Aggie for this introduction and this sort of generous hosting and doing to make this possible. Okay, so I am coming from the engineering world. I legitimately am at a college of engineering. I find that very weird because my background is very much other than that. So I come from, as Aggie just explained, more of the arts and design world, training with typographers like Wolfgang Weingart, the punk rock Swiss dude who has now passed, and very much in the weeds of the materiality of graphic design, then moved into this field that is now sort of loosely named critical computing, of thinking it through the sort of sightlines and computing that might be in other ways different elsewhere and reconfigured. And a lot of my thinking is attached to design, comes back to design, but also dabbles in other worlds and even things like IKEA. So I am often sitting on what is hard to see as a chair knitting and embedded in lots of fiber ways. You will soon find out. This work is also connected to many students I've worked with over the years, as well as colleagues in Seattle and Berlin, 2 places I've been situated, and in particular the students in my lab now who are engaged with or have just left these kinds of worlds of tactile design. Okay, so I wanted to start with an image and ask you to place it. What do you see? Just shout out whatever comes to your mind.
Seed.
Dandelion, nice.
Hair.
Seed. What else?
Hair.
Hair.
A spore.
Spore. Yes.
Fireworks.
Fireworks. Yes. What's that?
Magnetic field.
Ooh.
Fiber.
Firework? Is that?
Fiber.
Oh, fiber? Yes.
Or the fishing lure.
Amazing. Yeah, so the scale we're talking right now is like microscopic to gigantic. What if I told you it was data? Would that change it? What would we think now? Right? Network. Right. So moving through maybe abstractions all of a sudden. Okay, so the term fuzz, which maybe you could say is also a kind of a term that does talk to the sort of abstractions are hard to place, right? It's about making something to fuzz, to blur. But also here it's a very particular image. This is a seedling, as someone said from the very start, from a dandelion, yes. And it's maybe from my backyard, right? So it's very specific. And what I want to do in this talk is think through how the materiality of the abstractions that we engage very much in our world right now, things like data, things like computation, algorithm, the cloud, these are all very abstract, elusive concepts. But when we look at the materiality and when we engage them through, you might call this sensorium, through our bodies, through our embodied ways of knowing, we start to understand them differently. And we not only understand their histories differently, how they get made, whose bodies are invested in them, whose knowledge comes to matter, but also how those matterings come about and shape what we know today. So, so this talk is sort of starting with these two pillars of sort of thinking beyond the text and beyond sort of the stories that we understand with our textual and linguistic devices to those absented bodies, labors, knowledges behind design. And I'm just going to mention quickly some of those touch points from me have been thinking through recently Lorraine Daston's work on ontologies built on habit, as well as Pedro Pitarch's expressions, alternative relationships to ontologies through the fold, how we know through fabric, as well as Helen Gibson's notions of mattering, which is this notion of looking beyond what we see, what we know in the empirical to communicate otherwise. And this is really bringing together a large collection of works at the intersection of what you might call critical fiber studies, this engagement with materiality of fiber and vis-a-vis often craft work, and then histories of design and science of technology together. So many of us here engage with both of these fields, particularly the latter. So the sort of analytic threads I'll talk through in a moment are really based on a few often siloed methodological traditions. And so one being sort of traditional archival work, thinking about what exists in the formation of documents and in their engagement through material practice of reading those archived objects, as well as not there. And the ethnographic and oral history traditions that are more about empiricism, sort of drawing out and engaging with lived experience and storytelling. And lastly, the kinds of practices that come about through making and through design. So how we, through the process of production, can learn differently and understand. Okay, so that's the backdrop here. So I'm starting actually in 2014 at a TEDx talk in Australia, where this was a kind of moment when tech was still not quite speaking about the algorithm as we were just, but really still captivating a public audience with it. True believers, right? These kinds of stories of how well it's performing. And yet Yasmin Abdel Agid, who is a Sudanese Australian author and a mechanical engineer, is pulling out to this TEDx audience what is here a challenge. She says, someone who looks like me walks past you in the street. Do you think they're a mother, a refugee, a victim of oppression, or do you think they're a cardiologist, a barrister, or maybe a local politician? So she is speaking about bias. This is in her engagement, she is wearing a copper coral colored hijab that's gently draping around her head and neck, which is complementing the stiff fibers embroidered her abaya. And this is a very prescient point, right, where she's saying what the world expects of me and the way I'm treated depends on the arrangement of this piece of cloth, but looking beyond your bias. So for many of us, we think of bias, as she does, as a kind of habit of mind, right? It's a tendency to disfavor, to dislike a person or thing, especially as a result of a preconceived opinion. It's a stereotype, ultimately, as something that's based on characteristics, race, gender, disability. And in this theater, it's describing the way that our audience, many of whom are likely Judeo-Christian, identified as well, see this piece of cloth and make these negative assumptions based on her experience as a Muslim woman of color. And this cloth is expressing then that audience's bias. But what she doesn't say in this talk, and is also present, is the very arrangement of the cloth is not only revealing bias in it, it actually is bias, at least of a certain kind. The cloth is draping with the help of textile brain, with thread strands that are traversing the body not on the up and down, but along a slanted angle. And from this sort of etymology, then bias is referring to a slanting or sloping line, sort of a diagonal that's running from an angle from what we call the warp and the weft of fabric. So we can see many examples of bias as it's produced from fabric. Here it's an example of weaving on the bias through a loom on the diagonal, creating a particular stretch or elasticity, as well as bias tape weaving. Bias tape itself is cut on the bias to create collars and other stretchable items on almost everything we wear. And here we have a weaving with those very tapes on the bias, as well as the Stonehenge Neolithic basketry, so long-standing basketry traditions that are very much woven with that same structural form. And more contemporary examples that can take on a very kind of expressive for flexibly woven material. Now, much later, we see a fairly common now use of bias in the apparel industry, which is Madeleine Vionet's designs around drapery. So here, the drapery itself is allowed because of the bias cut of cloth, as well as the tight forming fit. And this was sort of an innovation that actually had, at least since medieval times, been used in the cutting of shorts and other forms. So to a tailor, then bias is referring to a tilt, right? A pretty powerful one in the industry, in fabric, made from these interlocking threads. So to cut on the bias is then to intentionally skew and to allow gravity, in a sense, to do its work, to push against the grain, to disrupt the binary of the warp and the weft. So it's an interruption of sort of Euclidean geometry to create something that fits right. So working on the bias does a number of things. In this case, from headscarves to cloth diapers to haute couture, there's a lot of workings of bias. And what we're seeing here at the TEDx talk is actually referring to a moment that's a few years before what has seemed like this now clarion call to think about bias, right? We hear it in the news, this notion that bias is embedded and even reproduced and further accentuated by algorithmic systems. That all of these ways in which, from data for Black lives to coded bias, the technological is then disproportionately affecting people along existing lines of inequity. So be that race, gender, disability, etc. Has fully not entered at this TED Talk the public consciousness when it comes to technology, but in a sense it had, right? If you think of textile as a technology too. So links between fibers and bits have run deep. As many computing historians remind us, the work of encoding information can be traced to ancient entanglements with string, pre-Columbian quipus, surviving Spanish colonialization, where the small knots are put into colorful threads that signify categories of knowledge. In recent interpretations by Colombian artist Constanza Pina Pardo as creating these sounds and interpretations of technology as, in her words, wisdom and history of ancestors. This connection then, centuries later, remerges with the field of computing inheriting a tactile legacy, where many of you have heard, the British Countess Ada Lovelace had gestured at a connection between the thread and the code. One of the earliest computer software engineers, she noticed the room ran on the single system of punch cards that produced the very same complex designs as early computers. And describing this alliance, she says we may say most aptly that the analytic engine weaves algebraic patterns, just as the Jacquard boom weaves flowers and leaves. Now we also see this connection undergirding patterns of exploitation within the early decades of the computing industry. This is where we see compelling of prophets in Fairchild, Electronics, and others who gendered and racialized subjects. Here is Navajo women in Shiprock, New Mexico, manufacturing Fairchild chips, described by Lisa Nakamura, and operators in Waltham, Massachusetts, who are wiring code that sent the Apollo spacecraft to the moon and back. And in these cases, we see how stereotypes associated with these kinds of nimble fingers or textile propensities were justifying the co-option of labor from minoritarian workers. This work has continued for me in early practices of design intervention, thinking about the augmentation of everyday craft materials, and forced me to encounter and re-encounter the problematics of these connections again. We see often wires working as threads or units of digital memory that are filling patchwork quilts, or techniques of embroidery that are encoding the path to the moon and back. It doesn't actually take a giant leap of imagination to imagine how these chips of computers might have grain and thread count and pattern, and how we cut on the bias, we might produce something wildly new. Okay, so we are going to do just that. We're going to do a mental exercise together. Take in your most sort of open-minded self a piece of cloth that you're wearing or have engaged more recently, and imagine it in your head. Just imagine the cloth before you. And I'm giving you a piece of, or I'm actually going to give you a pair of scissors, sharp ones, maybe, you'll see. And I want you to cut that cloth in your head on the bias. But I actually want you to do that to create a data set. Give you a minute to imagine that cloth and create a data set by cutting on the bias. What are you creating? A very weird invitation. Create a data set. What am I saying? What is it that you notice when you're imagining this? Cutting on the bias. Again, the diagonal of the cloth. You have a specific one in mind. Specific scissors. Yeah.
I imagine like the fray of the thread at the end of
Nice.
the cloth.
Something that you didn't maybe design for, but happened anyway.
Yeah.
That's edges that can be, maybe they dissolve the whole thing. So the data set might not exist later. Yeah.
Imagine how good that feels to have put a sharp pair of scissors in your cloth. Like how good that feels.
Yes. Your scissors are much better than mine. Yeah. Yes. So the sort of like visceral connection with that cut, that there's something there that, yes, in the production of your data. What is your data? Are you listening? Yeah.
I don't know this. I'm looking at the fabric and I have lines and a pattern. Yeah, they're printed or actually woven in the fabric. So I'm wondering, That could be my data, different threads that.
Nice. Yeah, so the collection of threads or the specific threads of then the data that you produce. Yeah,
My cloth was very personal, the one that I pictured, and so cutting it, the data turns into something about memory and time.
nice. So you're creating something that's almost a connection to, the data becomes that relational aspect. Wow, yeah.
I was thinking of like the shapes I'm cutting out of thinking this, like the collar and then sleeves and things like that.
So the sort of architecture of you're cutting up your own sweater, I mean, that's a lot. So it's heavy. So then that becomes the data. The data is the different parts. Okay, so these are great. These are reflections of something that we do in a class that I designed with Aphrodite Cassara and Gabriela Abdallah called On the Bias, that we ask questions about the materiality of our algorithmic system. And in particular, as you're noting, these are really poetic datafication moments, but in fact, asking you yourself to cut on the bias to create something like data really emphasizes all these aspects we typically cut out of the data analysis process. So data is always material, but in this case, we are noticing the tool, right, that is used to produce the data, or the skill set that might fray, right, the edges, or maybe it's the fact that I have a connection, a deeper connection to this data that I want to hold on to. There's a person and a body involved in that. So these kinds of exercises seeded this conversation over the last 3 years. This exercise began before our wave of generative AI in 2021, and it continued to think through at that time, what are these early formations of material expression that we can explore and interrogate otherwise? And in particular, Catherine Reese, who's an artist working here with felt fabric, was featuring a kind of use of an iOS screen time app, which was recording data of smartphone use, something many of us might do just to see where we're at. And instead of looking at these numbers, she produced these very soft felted structures. And each of the structures reflected where on the screen she had been touching. So we're representing those moments of contact. So with the felt, she kind of works with instances of unlocking the phone or other kinds of moments of engagement. And she recalls collecting the data, materializing it, maybe reflect on moments between virtual and actual space, noticing the differences in my inhabitation of each, and the constant of my bodily presence in both. So in engaging in those device encounters, she's exploring how movement and physicality affect how we inhabit the information. A later project of hers examined, in particular, histories of design within her own region, region where her family is from, Ilocos and Abra in the Philippines. And she was drawn to this indigenous weaving pattern that's called binakul, where there's sort of a repetition of curvature and form to warp geometries of a 90-degree grid. And in this, she is actually training, again, well before her ChatGPT moment, training an algorithm with her own data set to look at and reproduce and engage with this pattern. So looking at, in particular, the sort of contrast with the canon, in which you might have recognized the similarities here to 1960s op art that have very much erased Binacul's traditions in terms of their telling. So training this machine learning model on the images and produces this generated Binacul imagery that has an animation between, and producing a description of that surviving pre-war weavers that are continuously engaged with Binacul. and explaining in her words that an absence of tangibility made visible through an institutional effort to sustain a dying art is visible here. Shari Glovak-Smith is an artist who also co-taught a later version of this course with me, created in this series encoding of Audre Lorde's poems. Again, this is now an earlier generation of algorithmic tinkering that was encoding generated photographs of braided black hair, creating the images. They were training machine learning models on these hairstyles to produce a synthetic but realistic rendering, and exploring in many ways the angularity of techniques and resulting compositions. They were noticing something uniform in the patterns that worked like a language and leveraged that patterning to develop their own algorithm that treated the braided imagery as text. So mapping each phrase into a unique hairstyle and holding space in their words for the dichotomy between modern society's demonization of Black hair expression and its simultaneous appropriation of that same expression. So treating in some way these impossible geometries of algorithmically generated images as a language was reinventing this covert art. In reference to these modes, we might draw from Bettina and Judd in thinking how we can complicate as well as in spirit and re-embody through these engagements. Exercises like these are very much in conversation with conceptions of this bias that come out of several important touch points. And one being theorist Kemi Ademani's concept of the lean, a reference that is really engaged with the horizontal as evoking a form of carceral enforcement and vertical delimiting this notion that you must be proud or tall. Linda Brodsky is similarly describing bias in this angle or in a very different writing practice. And Marissa Fuentes is engaging with bias as a mode of reading the archive, an elasticity that's again pushing against and exceeding the dominance of a 90-degree. So these ideas of good posture or uprightness that Adeyemi notes is very much about revealing a body's resistance to tethering the ground, and particularly for those unevenly tied to the modes of enforcement. So amid these skewed orientations, or what you might find otherwise is not an answer so much as a kind of experimental praxis that is organized around the angularities. Across the bias cuts and binnacle patterning and braided poetry, these are all on the bias projects that have a certain sensibility that organize themselves as a material gathering, not just of string, but of different sidelines and timelines and potentials. And those are the kinds of experiments that bring kind of greater imagination to our contact with perspectives and with one another. So over the course of 3 to 4 years now, this exercise has been put into the textile bias space, but they very much engage with the design praxis writ large. They are exercises that help us understand data as modes of not just the found, but as material realities. So here we're seeing that there isn't inevitability around what counts as data. It's always a decision and it has a politics and labor. And those power arrangements and structural formations of power within algorithmic systems get remade or undone vis-a-vis those engagements. So here, fabric is again telling a story about something material, shaping something cultural, and across these multiple registers. So it's combining biases not to remove them, as we hear constantly in the press, but actually to collectively work against the grain, to skew those relationships to the everyday and turn our material conditions into an invitation for change. And of course, textile bias across computing histories and design histories has emerged again and again in very particular forms that are, again, about absence in the archive. But core memory, which Aggie mentioned earlier, is actually also making use of, in its plain version, the information storage retrieval techniques. So of a diagonal thread. So a diagonal thread running through the plane is what allows it to be actually rewritten as well as accessed. And this is again an earlier version that's rope memory used on the Apollo guidance computer in the Apollo 11 mission. But bias thread appears in all forms and modes of electronic consumer products, where we see not just in our everyday microwaves or appliances, but also in particular forms of medical devices. In this case, I've just begun a project examining the history of an alloy called nitinol, which is a nickel titanium fusion that can be flexibly refigured and returned to its original shape. In this example of the device is designed and brought to market by Bolivian doctors Franz Freudenthal and Alexandra Heath, who in their original formation manufactured the work Andean women pictured to the right. And this particular mode of assemblage is actually working with what they call the indigenous Amara Chakana cross, which is symbolizing symmetry and interconnectedness. So a very, very unique fusion of the engagements that are hidden, the labor stories that are, again, eventually displaced and devalued, but in this very moment of taking this photograph in the journal JAMA are also celebrated and kind of engaged with what that means in the moment. So this longer process is examining how nitinol industries in the weaving trades are overlapping in their engagements technically, but actually also very much a part of demarcations of knowledge that are separating out whose labor is seen as innovation labor and whose is hidden and absented from those stories. I'm engaging with this now in classwork with several students from the Human-Centered Design and Engineering department in an Art Worlds of Science and Technology Studies course, where we're really thinking through these entanglements as a mode of questioning some of the politics and histories of design practice within their own work. And as a last play, this is now kind of moving into our sales pitch. I wanted to invite you all to come visit and engage with these students and our growing community of scholars and practitioners asking questions at these intersections as part of a Science Technology Studies conference that I am helping organize in September. So this will have a Dean Festival for those of you in magazine class, as well as other exhibition modes and making and doing event, and very much trying to create places and sites for these kinds of engaged dialogues. So panels are due right now. February 2nd. Thank you all so much.